figuring out what they are. But you can also just think about it as multiplying the interactions directly here and following the rules of multiplication. So in a chain like this, we have plus times plus. So changes in the basal prey species here benefits this species, and this species benefits this one, and you multiply them together to get an indirect interaction that's plus. If we want to get an indirect interaction here, we have a negative interaction. We multiply that by the other negative interaction, and we get an indirect positive effect. So that's a quick way to look at indirect interactions within interaction webs. You know, we can talk about mutualisms, and the same thing works. Positive times a positive. So in this sort of simple mutualistic framework where you only have benefits going around you, you'll have indirect mutualism between the organisms. If we make this anyone know what interaction that is? We have two consumers sharing the same prey resource. What is indirect interactions? What's the indirect interaction of this guy and this guy? Negative. And how about this one and this one? Negative times the positive, so negative. So this is basically resource competition. I always find it sort of troubling that the first interaction I always teach in 201 is we talk about this interaction of resource competition. It's really the indirect interaction, but we're really talking about this big direct interaction. There are certain sets of these simple sort of modules of interactions that have names. So these are food chain. We have resource competition. We have shared predators. This is plus, minus, minus. What are the, anyone want to tell me? I'll give you a hint, they're symmetrical. What are the interactions here? Are they positive or negative? I'll give a couple seconds and then we'll go cold. Raise your hand if you think these are net negative interactions. Raise your hand if you think they're net positive.
I don't understand what the difference is between that one and the one on the shared side.
So these are two consumers that share the same resource.
Oh.
These are two resources that share the same consumer.
Okay.
Right? Because here the negatives are flowing away from the shared organism.
Yeah, I see that.
So most of you thought it was net positive between them. Recall, arrow here, this species benefits the shared predator, but this predator negatively affects the other food source. So these are negative interactions. So basically, if you benefit a shared predator, that means that predator will be a higher abundance, and that will suppress the other prey populations. This is called a parent competition.
Is that assuming like no type 3 interaction then? So like at one level they'll quit predating the other? Like wouldn't it benefit?
So in this case it's independent of that.
Okay.
You might have, you're kind of talking about a non-linearity in the response, but in general, even if you have sort of this is really talking about the equilibrium approach. So if you in the short term increase this one, yeah, maybe the predator would shift over here to consume it, but there'd eventually be a feedback. So that predator population would increase. It would then reduce this one in some sense, and then that would then go back to the negative sense. But yeah, it is an equilibrium view or a long-term view of these effects. And we combine these two we're talking about predator-mediated competition. Okay, so what is the indirect effect of predator on consumer two here? So first of all, you guys think, oh, wait, is there an indirect effect? What pathway does that take? We already know that the predator has a negative effect on consumer two. And the consumer has a positive effect on the predator, but what's the pathway for the indirect effect? Why would there be a direct indirect effect or there's a direct effect?
Yeah.
Because
Like you mean through consumer, like all the way around?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's the same indirect effects that we talked about here, sort of those combined. So this predator has a negative effect on this consumer, which benefits the resource. So we have negative times a negative, that's a positive, times a positive. So you can think about the net indirect effect on this consumer through this food web is positive, but the direct effect is negative. So what is the effect based on these rules?
What was the indirect effect? It was negative.
It was negative because we have it reduces its competitor. That this competitor would reduce the resource, so that's two negatives. Then you multiply and you get a positive. And then this resource has a positive effect on that consumer. So negative times a negative is a positive times a positive.
So the indirect is positive.
The indirect effect is positive. Basically what you're doing is the predator is reducing your competitor.
So would you, I guess, determine that based on the strengths of each different
Exactly.
types of different
Yeah.
interactions?
And I'm going to talk about that a bit more, but once we start talking about more complicated food webs, we start to get into the situation where qualitatively we don't know what the net interaction effects are. And you can imagine, so then there's, so this is actually called predator-mediated competition. And then there's omnivorous. So these are the sort of really simple so this is basically adding ambiguity to this food chain, because the indirect effect here is what? Positive. What's its indirect effect?
Positive.
It's indirect effect of the resource on the predator, mediated by the shared consumer.
Positive.
Positive.
Okay, so indirect is positive, so both positive.
Yep. That's a classic trophic cascade food chain. The predator suppresses the herbivore, which releases the prey, the plant. So here we have, once again, we have a direct effect which is negative because the predator is consuming its resource, but the indirect effect is positive because the predator is also consuming the resource of the competitor. And I haven't done this in a while. We look at the indirect effect of these two on each other, right? So this consumer is, what's the indirect effect of the consumer on its predator?
Negative?
Yeah, positive.
And this indirect effect is negative. Because basically this is, the indirect effects make them kind of like resource competitive, because they're a shared resource. Now this is called omnivory.
So if the predator's eating the consumer, what exactly is the concept of the indirect effect there?
So the indirect effect is the pathway through the resource. So what is the effect of the species P on consumer via the pathway of the resource? So by potentially reducing the resource, it reduces the amount of food available for the consumer.
Oh, because the predator's eating the resource as well.
Yeah.
If you look at in all these, you know, like the back and forth, right? So like from like P to C back to P, is that a way to look at like interest-specific
Yeah.
competition?
Yeah. So that's basically, you can show, yeah, that's exactly right. You can show the indirect effect of the predator mediated through its consumer, the interest in the competition.
But then if you have like a